Thank you, Barney. I think I can say on behalf of all of Ceres that we are very grateful for your leadership. My name is Nancy Floyd. I'm a member of Ceres President's Council. I'm also founder and managing director of Nth Power, a pioneering clean energy venture capital firm in San Francisco. I've also served on several utility company boards, which is why I'm delighted to introduce the second part of our Build Back Better plenary. Yesterday, we heard from Boston Mayor Marty Walsh, Federal Highway Deputy Administrator Stephanie Pollack, and new EPA Administrator Michael Regan about the future of clean transportation, green jobs, and renewable energy projects. Now we're welcoming back Kisa Shreen to talk with Pedro Pizarro, CEO of Edison International, and Badar Khan, President of National Grid, two of the country's largest investor-owned utilities, to discuss how their companies are working to align with aggressive commitments to reorient towards the Paris Agreement. Our speakers will also be exploring how we can and must create a future with a greener economy and infrastructure. With that, I'll pass it over to Kisa to get this important conversation started. Thank you.
Welcome to part 2 of our plenary session on Building Back Better. And thank you, Nancy, for that introduction. We're going to jump right in. Yesterday, we heard from Stephanie Pollack, Marty Walsh, and Michael Regan, and they shared their thoughts on direction moving forward in terms of infrastructure. Today, we're going to hear from 2 utility companies that are looking to deliver on the Biden administration's call to action to turbocharge the green economy and tackle climate change. Pretty big steps that we have in front of us, but they're going to break it down for us. As part of one of those areas, there was a call to action to achieve carbon-free electricity by 2035. And the question is, can utility companies practically get there by 2035? And what does the transition to a low carbon economy look like? So let's move to our experts for answers. Pedro, what is the plan for getting there, and what are the challenges and strategies that you're employing to meet those challenges?
Well, thanks a lot, Kisa. And let me start by framing a little background from the perspectives from which we see this at Edison. We have both our Southern California Edison utility serving 15 million residents in Southern California, and we have Edison Energy that's working with commercial and industrial customers at a national and actual global scale. So a couple of different viewpoints on this. So I look at this from the California example for our utility. We've done a fair amount of work around something we call our Pathway 2045 white paper that outline our vision for how California meets its mandate of net zero economy-wide by 2045. Now, that's 5 years sooner than the US's 2050 target in line with the Paris Accord. And as you mentioned, Kisa, President Biden has outlined the potential for 2035 being clean energy in the power sector alone. I think the punchline there, and then a little more context. So punchline is, it may be feasible technologically. It will require a lot more technology R&D and technology deployment. And it does raise some questions about affordability and equity and the way getting there. The context for that is using the California analysis. What we found was that in order for California to get there to its net zero target most affordably, it's really important to optimize across the whole economy. And so what we saw for California, and I think this applies at a national level, this is consistent, for example, with the National Academy of Sciences report that came out recently, is that we saw in California the pathway there being 100% carbon-free delivered energy. That means adding 80 gigawatts of renewables at the bulk power level and 30 gigawatts of storage, and using distributed resources, 30 gigawatts of distributed renewable resources and 10 gigawatts of behind the meter storage. Using all that clean energy to electrify a lot of the economy, 3/4 of passenger vehicles and 70% of building and space water heating. But we also see that there are places in the economy that are hard to electrify. So there you might need low carbon fuels like hydrogen for some of those applications. And you need negative carbon too, right? You need the ability to capture carbon, whether it's through direct air capture or sequestration or natural working lands. But again, this all requires R&D and technology deployment to get there. And so what we found was that even when you have 100% carbon-free delivered energy at the wholesale level, right, because you have line losses, in California, in our analysis, it still made sense to allow just a little bit of flex there for some fossil fuels still being in the mix at the wholesale level. In our analysis, something like 6% of electrons were still being generated by natural gas in 2045. And the reason for that was that made it more affordable, because the last dollar you spend to get out the last CO2 molecule from the power sector alone can probably get you a lot more CO2 molecules more affordably if you spend that dollar instead electrifying a vehicle or adding a heat pump or working elsewhere in the economy. So that's why we see the Biden target as one that, in terms of direction, we support, again, directionally, but the devil's in the details. And it may make more sense for the economy to do this more affordably and to do it equitably, right? To make sure that this is a transition that's being fair to everybody, regardless of class, regardless of economic status. It might make more sense to allow for a little bit of margin there, in the power sector that can also help increase reliability for the power sector, while then focusing on getting that total net zero picture done on an economy-wide basis at the lowest cost possible.
Wow, that's great. And you know what, Pedro, I'm glad you brought up the socioeconomic aspect of that. And we're definitely going to talk about that a little later, but mention some great details, as you say. We talked about here the R&D and tech that's required, as well as the need to optimize across the economy. But Dar, curious to hear your thoughts. I know National Grid has substantial electric and gas businesses. How will National Grid get there? Are your strategies going to be a bit different? Are there some other details that you think you might need to think through in terms of getting to that goal?
Yeah, well, Kisa, thank you for having me, first of all. A little like Pedro out, National Grid is at least on the utility side, we're a large electricity and gas transmission and distribution utility, serving about 20 million people in the Northeast, so in New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. We are also proud to be a principal sponsor, partner of COP26 in the UK this year, and so we're committed to taking, the action that we can to mitigate the impacts of climate change. We have also set an ambition to reach net zero by 2050, which includes not just the emissions from our own company, but also reducing the emissions from the sale of energy to our customers. And that goes beyond carbon-free electricity, as Pedro was saying, but extends to transport and heat, which I think make the kind of question a little bit more complicated. But to answer your question on carbon-free electricity by 2035, clearly we'll need to see investment in generation, but also certainly up here, significant investment in transmission to be able to get all the new sources of generation to customers. And I'll just give you just a couple of things that we are doing to try and get us there, if that's okay. On offshore, we've signed contracts to procure 200 terawatt hours of renewable energy for our customers in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. That's enough power to supply about half our customers' consumption by 2026. And these are long-term contracts that go out to 2045. Clearly, the amount of offshore wind that we're looking for in the Northeast states is going to be huge. And we need to make sure, in terms of hurdles that you asked, we need to make sure that the states are working together. Otherwise, we're just going to end up with just a ton of connections into land. And there's historically been quite a lot of, not in my backyard here, opposition to offshore connections. At the distributed resources, distributed generation connection level, we've got to, as Pedro said again, we've got to just double down and triple down on our investment there. To date, we've connected around 90,000 interconnections of sort of distributed solar solutions, a ton of battery energy solutions, about 2 gigawatts in our regions, but we'll just need to do a whole lot more. And again, the question there will be, at what extent does the interconnection request at the distribution level impact investment at the transmission level? So it's the same kind of theme that we're seeing. You talked about, Pedro talked about society-wide emissions reduction. And I think for us, that means, I think the more complicated area is around heating. Over 60% of our customers use gas for heating. A quarter of our households in our territories, it's over 1 million customers, are still using some of the most pollutant fuels to heat their homes, like oil and propane. So if we're going to convert those customers, or those customers choose to convert themselves over to electric heating and natural gas over to electric heating, we're just going to see, need even more generating capacity and even more transmission investment. I think the interesting thing for us up in the Northeast is that in a world where all heat is electric, we're going to need, we'll see a winter peak for energy supply that's double that of the summer peak for air conditioning load. And so that, I think that introduces an interesting dynamic where the electricity load is more sensitive to weather in the winter than it is in the summer. So we're going to think about, well, how do we actually serve that kind of system? And I think it's going to be around more generation, again, more transmission that's bringing in generation from across the region, as well as seasonal storage. And I agree with Pedro. I think we're going to have to think about the heating question quite carefully, because gas is the more affordable form of heating, and we'll need to think through alternative forms of heating beyond just electrifying the heat. So renewable natural gas, hydrogen, and other pathways.
Great. And so some of the details that we're talking about here, transmission investment as well as seasonal storage. And one of the other things that we've talked a lot about is just the infrastructure that we're seeing around electric vehicles. I think we've been talking about that before the session. As you know, one of the ways we're looking to get to this point, is by building up infrastructure around electric vehicles. I'm wondering, how are you working to create this infrastructure in terms of adoption? So you have adoption in terms of the consumers, and then you have the suppliers. There are so many elements to this. So if you could talk about that with us, Pedro, in terms of adoption around EVs, how do you suspect that will play out?
Well, I mentioned already that the large role that transportation electrification will have to play to get to net zero. And so part of adoption is making sure that we have the infrastructure ready, right? And we're doing our part as the electric sector, but also collaborating with the auto OEMs, the charging companies, with groups that can help educate customers and the like. Starting writ large with the grid itself. In addition to our Pathway 2045 white paper, we published something called Reimagining the Grid just last December that talks about how the electric grid itself needs to evolve to be able to be flexible and be able to handle not only the load for electrification, but also the clean energy resources that are getting connected to fuel these new applications. Now, double clicking in on the electric vehicle side, we're working, as are a number of utilities across the country, on making sure that we have these benefits flowing to customers and can set up that infrastructure. In SCE's case, SCE is deploying around $800 million in investment across a number of charging-related programs. We have one program, our Charge Ready 2 program, that's over $400 million that will lead to something like 38,000 chargers deployed in the next 4 or 5 years in the Southern California region. By the way, that's less than a third of the chargers that will be needed on the way to 2025, let alone 2030 or 2035. So it's a good start. It's a start, but it's just a start. By the way, out of that over $400 million, almost half the investment, around $200 million, is being dedicated to multifamily dwellings, to disadvantaged communities, and to economically impacted communities, because it's important that this transition be one where there's access for everybody, not just for folks who can buy the more expensive vehicles today. We have a Charge Ready Transport program, and that's a companion to this, that's helping to deploy charging infrastructure at customer sites to support plug-in buses and medium and heavy duty trucks and forklifts. And so really on the heavier duty side. And then finally, we need to be engaged in advocacy and partnerships. And I'm really proud that I get to work with Badar's colleague, John Pettigrew, the CEO of National Grid. We are co-chairs of the EEI's CEO Electric Transportation Task Force. And there we're having utilities across the country collaborate on sharing practices to make the electrification experience more consistent nationally, not just for customers, but for OEMs and for large fleets as well. We also have to lead by example. So more than 70% of the EEI member companies, investor-owned utilities, serving more than 200 million U.S. customers, have already made their own fleet electrification commitments. And so at SCE, this means that 100% of our light-duty vehicles will be electric by 2030, and we also have set targets in a number of other categories. But it's really important that, I think to the point of your question as well, that we help educate customers, right? Because the reality is that today, the lower priced electric vehicles already on the market are more economic over the lifetime or on a total cost of ownership basis than many gasoline-powered vehicles. But I think from a customer perspective, that understanding what's involved in the electric vehicle experience is something where they need support and education and communication. And then finally, we also need to make sure we're thinking about what does the map look like in terms of infrastructure needed for various applications. So we're proud to be participating with a number of other utilities across the West Coast, from California through Oregon, Washington, on the West Coast Clean Transit Corridor Initiative. And that's basically identified what it will take to have a continuous corridor with charging stations around every 50 miles apart, going all the way up the coast. And that's developed something like 60-some conceptual charging sites that will be needed, where we can collaborate with our peers to make that happen.
Wow. So collaboration, partnership, education, it all seems to play a huge part. And Badar, I want to kick this over to you and talk about California specifically. We all know that they have tremendous policy support, and they really seem to be leading in this area, from education to the research and development we talked about earlier. Whether we're talking about California utilities and that 2020 storage mandate that they met around having enough storage to meet a percentage of peak demand. If we're talking about the startups and the sheer technology behind thermal storage and other types of storage that's being investigated and researched now, they're doing a lot. So tell us, how are things different in the Northeast US and for the national grid as a whole, as opposed to what you see going on in California? And what are you learning, similar to what we just talked about, from other utility companies in terms of approaches?
Yeah, so Kisa, I think the Northeast is catching up fast in terms of policy support and action in electrifying transport. Last year, New York approved a statewide EV charging program. That's the largest in the country outside of California. We've been investing in charging infrastructure programs across the north, so the Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York. And this summer, we'll be proposing larger scale programs that we know that policymakers and regulators will support. All three states have decarbonization plans that include electrification of transport with some strong policy proposals today. I think it's important that we advocate for policy coordination at the federal level, as Pedro was saying. Without it, I think we are at the risk of having a patchwork of charging infrastructure where it's, we've got a lot of infrastructure in the coasts and dense urban areas, but we don't want to have the remote and rural areas left out. I think everyone needs to be benefiting from cleaner air. In terms of what specifically needs to happen in the Northeast, I think the goals are ambitious. National Grid plays a role where we are helping to minimize the cost for the charging station companies, by making make-ready investments. So that's utility and customer side infrastructure, just everything except the charging station itself, which the charging station companies bring, to meet the trajectory that we think that most people think we need to get to net zero by 2050. So society-wide electric supply, transport, heat. And then I'm working backwards. We think we'll need, 10 to 20 times more electric vehicles on the roads today, and that's an equivalent number of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So what do we need to get there? It's all the things that Pedro said. So we've got to encourage consumer take-up. Transparency on the total cost of ownership, I think, is really important. The policy support in terms of rebates and incentives, off-peak rates to help customers or encourage customers to charge at home. I think these are the kinds of things that we need to see and that we are, I think, seeing. We're quite excited about the fleet segment. It's clearly a big area. And we've got a fleet advisory service helping fleet customers think through their roadmaps for converting trucks and buses. I think these are the kinds of things that are that are being put in place. What can we learn from other utilities, you asked? Well, again, I think there's, as Pedro said, there's a lot of collaboration across the industry. One thing that I was quite excited about was learning about a program in Southern California where we're installing chargers on utility poles rather than ground-mounted charging, and that's something that we're trying out in Massachusetts. Over in the UK, there's a lot of policy support and conversation around chargers along transmission lines, so that we've got this sort of a highway backbone system of chargers. And I think those are the kinds of things that I think that we're looking to work into our proposals.
Great. I want to just switch gears just slightly here and transition to a slightly different topic, but one that's just as important. President Biden was recently quoted as saying that 40% of all benefits need to go to economically disadvantaged communities. And, you know, we saw in Texas a few weeks ago, as we've seen repeatedly over the years, that there is a discrepancy between disadvantaged and underserved communities and some of the solutions and services that are brought to them. In fact, we know that the stimulus package was set to provide $100 million for the Environmental Protection Agency, and just about half of that specifically was designated for environmental justice grants and activities to help communities that are disproportionately burdened by pollution. And this is for both of you. How are your organizations making sure these communities receive these benefits? You know, what are the hurdles to getting there, and how do we see a smooth way forward for this to happen?
Well, I'll kick off if that's okay, Kisa. I mean, I think first of all, I'm very happy to see the focus on environmental justice. I think that in societal transformations, it's the segment of society, the disadvantaged or lower income that actually stand to benefit the most from societal transformation, are sometimes the ones that are just honestly left behind. As a regulated utility, we don't choose our customers. We serve everyone. And so making sure that nobody is left behind is a very important part of the DNA of 17,000 people that work here at National Grid in the US. So we've been asking ourselves the same question that you just asked: is every segment of society benefiting from the programs that we offer? Are we reaching those communities that we think are most disadvantaged today? Can we find more ways to reach them? Are there barriers that are preventing people from accessing some of these programs, whether it's financing conditions or the fact that, many folks in lower income communities are often renting rather than owning their homes, and so may not be taking advantage of all the things that we offer in our energy efficiency programs, for example. So let me just give you a couple of examples of things that we are doing. We just talked about clean transport. Black, Asian, and Latinx residents, from what I read, are exposed to 30% more vehicle pollution than white residents. In Massachusetts, we've installed about 1,000 vehicle charging ports. 70 to 75% of these are publicly accessible, and 35% of those are in what we call environmental justice communities. EVs, I think as Pedro said, aren't affordable for everybody. And so we've been working with major transit authorities in places like New York and Albany and Buffalo, and school districts in Massachusetts to actually put electric buses on the road that is accessible to people that don't have vehicles. Our energy efficiency programs is something that we've been leaning in on for many years, where we provide energy efficiency upgrades, so that's heating systems, appliances, insulation, at no cost to low and medium income customers. And that's something that we've been working on for quite a long time. We're looking to expand language access in our programs. We're looking to identify barriers like financing or other conditions that prevent people from accessing these programs once they are aware. So those are the kind of things that we're doing. I got to tell you, when President Biden said, he described the administration's efforts on equity as an all of government approach. We are thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion in the same way. What is the impact that we can have with respect to diversity and inclusion within our organization? What's the impact that we can have in the ecosystem that we operate in? We're a company that invests $4 to $5 billion a year. We work with a lot of partners. How can we have an impact on inclusion and equity there? And the impact that we can have in our community. So the kind of offerings and programs that we just talked through. we're proud to lean in here, and I think this is an important part of this energy transition that we're in.
Great information, Badar. Thank you so much. Pedro, what about you, your firm? How are you working toward this end goal?
Well, this is very real for us, and it was great to hear, Badar's description of what National Grid is doing, all the great work there. When you look at Southern California, SCE has a disproportionate number of the state's most vulnerable communities. Something like 46% of the state's disadvantaged communities are in our territory, but we only serve about 40% of the state. About a third of our residential customers, 1/3, are in a low income rate. And importantly, about 90% of California's population breathes unhealthy levels of air pollution during some point in the year. So this is not just about greenhouse gas reduction and climate change. It is about local air quality, particularly when you think about highway corridors with heavy duty trucks. So these clean energy policies will do a lot more than just deal with the global climate or about the local climate as well. We have to start now, and we have to do it in a way that's equitable. And by the way, in terms of starting now, there was a recent study by the Energy Innovation Group that looked at the cost of achieving net zero by 2050. And if we start now versus delaying to 2030, delaying to 2030 will result in costs that are 72% higher, right? And so, and will create a real back, rush in the curve. So that will impact these disadvantaged communities even more negatively. Now, there's a lot of investment that's needed here, but here's the important promise of it, right? In our California analysis, we saw that we'll need something like $250 billion spent statewide between now and 2045 just for the clean energy, storage, and related grid investments. However, the promise of all that is this. In 2045, the average customer in California will probably have a higher electric bill because they'll be using more electricity, and we'll need to recover all those investments that I was talking about. But their total cost across all forms of energy will be 1/3 lower than it is today in real terms. And that's because of the high efficiency of electric motors and heat pumps and the like. And that means that there's value there to then help enable, particularly the customers who are least able to afford the transition. We need to protect them, and so we need to have programs to help them, whether it be incentives or tax benefits or the like. And so that's an important way then of facilitating the transition, and we're doing things like what Badar was mentioning in terms of targeting more of our programs towards providing support for these communities, whether it's the charging programs I mentioned earlier, the discounts on vehicles, the subsidies and incentives that are income qualified and targeting those communities. Maybe one final note, I think all of us as corporations have a role to play beyond just our specific electric programs. And this is really about having diversity, equity, and inclusion be a broad part of our company's focus. So for us, it's all about attracting, retaining, and paying fairly a diverse team. It starts with our board, which is one of the most diverse in the S&P 500. It goes on through our activities for our employees with our disclosures. Last August, we disclosed more information, I think, than about any S&P 500 company, because we talk not only about our representation across ethnic and gender groups, but also how we pay, what our employee sentiment is, what we do in terms of the communities. We shared how 40% of SCE spending goes to diverse suppliers. We talked about our charitable giving, where we give at least $20 million a year in shareholder funding, but at least 80% of that is targeted for diverse and underserved communities. So I think as energy companies, we have a role to play beyond just the electric grid that we manage, and frankly, being examples and collaborating with other industries and with NGOs and really with the communities around us to help diverse, equitable, and inclusive societies, a real thing.
Edison and National Grid leading the way. We talked a lot about investing in R&D, research and development, as well as investing in technology, also investing in communities and ensuring that those opportunities via subsidies and the like are available. Also optimizing across the whole economy. It really takes a village, or as we said earlier, it takes partnerships, and partnering across the EV, the electric vehicle ecosystem, is one way to get there. Loads of information and great solutions. Thank you so much, Badar and Pedro, for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.